I'm very excited to go ahead and introduce our next presenter, Michael Daly. Michael is the Senior DevOps Consultant at Provar Testing. He will be presenting Closing the Salesforce Test Automation Gap. Michael, thank you so much for being here. Feel free to go ahead and take the floor.
Thank you, Erica. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about how we can close the regression gap for your DevOps pipelines and also how we can unlock more from your Salesforce orgs with test automation. As Erica introduced me before, my name is Michael Daly. I am a DevOps consultant here at Provar Testing. And I'll give a brief introduction to the company before I get started into the presentation itself. So Provar as a company was founded about 6 years ago. We do have offices internationally, but we are based out of the UK in London. We are specializing in Salesforce specific testing and test automation. And a lot of our team members and consultants here come from a background in both manual and automated QA processes. We're sitting around almost 800 community users right now with around 40 partners, and we are a registered Salesforce partner as well. So with that in mind, I'll get started with the presentation itself. So when we talk about the regression gap, the best way to illustrate this is just through a simple story. So for those of you that are admins or developers or architects or whatever your role might be, I just want you to kind of think back to the first release or application or feature that you were a part of and think about kind of how that process began. So looking at this graph here, what we're trying to illustrate is that the first release, everything's going to be new. All the code and configuration that you're introducing to this target environment is all going to be brand new to that, and none of it's been tested before. So in every subsequent release, you see the pink here is really illustrating how this existing code and configuration can grow over time. And as this grows, so does the need to be able to test it at a more rapid pace to keep up with the release cycles and make sure that you're delivering all of your releases on time. So this is what we refer to as the regression gap. And regression testing throughout the context of this presentation is really going to mean testing something that's already been tested. So we want to be able to keep up with the current releases, but we also want to plan to test all the existing code and configuration that's persisting through each release cycle. So how can we close this? So we'll talk through 3 different options for closing this regression gap and keeping up. The first option is a pretty simplistic one, and that is just adding more time for testing. So it would be great if we had the ability just to add another week into our release cycles, but for a lot of us, this is not necessarily a viable solution. For example, if you're on a 2 or 3 week sprint, it's not exactly feasible to just fit in another day or so or another week entirely to add time for testing. And so thinking about this, of course, this is going to slow down your releases. So if you do add more time for testing in your release cycle, your releases get pushed back more and more, and you're always really playing catch up. You never really get to where you need to be. And then of course you need the actual QAs performing the testing to go in there and do it. So that's going to consume more of their time and take time of whatever task they may have been doing. And the second option here is when we see a lot of companies do is that they just try to add more resources, adding more testers. Well, this doesn't always translate to double the work. For example, if you have one QA resource and you add another one, it doesn't always translate to having twice the work done and twice the amount of test coverage. And additionally, this can be very costly. So it's adding an entirely new resource to your team. Not only is it costly in terms of money, but in terms of time and getting them onboarded, getting them up to speed with the application and your testing strategies and processes. And of course, this doesn't really scale either. So you can't just continually add more testers as your application grows and as your regression gap increases. So the third option here is one we're really going to unpack a little more, and that is automate. So when we talk about automation, this kind of deserves its own definition. So in the context of this presentation and from the Provar testing side of things, when we talk about test automation, what we're really talking about is just the practice of actually running repeatable tests automatically. And the key word here is repeatable. So we want these test cases to be consistent, we want them to be robust, and we want them to execute in the same manner every time they're ran. So this kind of is, the whole point of this is that it eliminates the human element, right? We're trying to get rid of the unreliable tests that tend to be run through a manual process that can run one way, 1 week, and then the next week be ran in an entirely different way. So talking more about kind of test automation and its benefits, I'll kind of go through a few here, and then we'll talk about some of the different contrasting elements to test automation. So firstly, kind of going along with the repeatable aspect, this is going to have improved consistency in your releases and your testing strategy. So with any kind of test automation, what you're really doing is you're setting yourself up in a way that every regression cycle, you're making sure that everything you're testing is always going to be the same. There's no variation there. So it's very consistent and it's very robust. And also, this is going to speed up your regression cycles. So when we talked about adding more time in that first option, automation is kind of the flip side of that. This is going to help save you time when it comes to actually releasing your releases and your deployments, because you're going to be able to factor in test automation into your DevOps pipelines and hopefully cut back down on your actual release cycles, because you can schedule these test cases to run overnight and you don't have to worry about them actually taking up a period of your workday. And of course, the central component to test automation is that it is fully autonomous, the concept of fire and forget. So you don't have to actually babysit the test cases. You should be able to schedule them, execute them, and not have to worry about what's happening. Just have them do their thing. And then when they're finished, get the reports, get the results, send those to the required stakeholders, and then do what you need to from there. And this last point we'll unpack a little bit more. And this is really one that we kind of want to stress, because this is really going to reduce the monotony of your QA actual tasks. So rather than the QA testing the same thing over and over again, test automation is meant to take that aspect of QA and hopefully give them more time to focus on other tasks that are both more interesting and more valuable. And so one of the negative side effects that some people think of when they hear the word automation is that automation is replacing humans. It may be actually replacing their existing, whatever their current tasks are. And that's not really what we're trying to do here. What we're really trying to do is supplement that. And so these couple tweets just kind of illustrate the humorous side of it. But the second one here on the right is really kind of the funny part about it, is that if a QA is really, their underlying job is to think of all the different ways that they can run an application, the different data they can supply to it to get different results. And in the end, of course, you can never really predict everything. And some things happen that no one really thought the customer or the client was actually going to do, and the application breaks because there was a scenario that no one thought of, right? So the QA's job is really just to be a very creative and out-of-the-box thinker. We're not trying to get rid of testers. We're trying to get them to do more tasks that are both more interesting and valuable, and get rid of the tasks that they don't like running the same regression test every single week or every single month, or however often your release cycle is. And so talking a bit more about testing approaches. So this graph on the left here is really talking about two different things. So on the left side, we have the level of customization. So in reference to your Salesforce orgs, this is ranging from anywhere from low to high. So if you don't have very much customization, you may be able to squeeze by with just doing a lot of manual testing, because you don't really have to worry about the different elements that you're changing or different parts of Salesforce that you're modifying, because Salesforce is roughly a stable platform. So if you're not really making a lot of changes, then manual testing may be feasible in that option. Of course, as your level of customization grows, the need for some kind of automation arises, because you really need to be able to test all the different scenarios and all the different workflows that you've added in. And of course, this kind of goes along with the frequency of changes as well. So how often are you actually making these releases, and how often are your changes coming through the pipeline? This is really going to determine whether or not you're going towards an automated or manual route as well. So in other words, if you have a 1-week release cycle and you have to do regression testing every single time you have a release, it's not exactly feasible or reasonable to expect your QA resources to do the same test cases every single week you have a release. So this would be a candidate for automation as well. Now, thinking about this in a little bit different contexts. So rather than thinking about the level of customization, thinking about the level of complexity. So how much code or underlying complexity do you have to your application or org? So this, of course, as you increase the level of complexity, the need for automation arises here as well, because there's really going to be more advanced pieces of your Salesforce that are not going to be testable in a reasonable amount of time through manual effort. And of course, as those workflows get longer and more complex, they become more difficult to execute the same way each time. So automation kind of takes the burden of that away from the manual QA and puts it in a reusable process that you can run each release. And one here that we really want to kind of stress as well is the impact on the business. So really more thinking now about the risk of certain things breaking in your application, such as the login feature or the ability to go to a product page, add a product, and make purchases and that kind of thing. So if those particular workflows or processes were to break, how much impact would they have on the business, both as a monetary side of things and also just a functional one? So based on the impact of the business, it may be worthwhile to move those kind of test scenarios to more of an automated route, so that way you're really covering your bases each release cycle and you're not relying on the manual tests to be performed the exact way, because if there's any variation of all, the test could pass as far as they're concerned. However, they may have missed one of the important scenarios that has a very high impact on the business. And so there's two other words here on this page that I've kind of glossed over, and that is declarative and coded automation. So I'll kind of talk about those a little bit more in the following slides. Firstly, I'll talk about code-based test automation. So what you see here, for those of you that are not familiar, this is the Selenium framework, which is an open source test automation framework. This particular code snippet is written in Java. And all this is really doing is just showing you how you can log in to Salesforce using this framework, this code-based test automation framework. All it's doing is retrieving a username and a password from an Excel file where we save those credentials. And then it's finding the elements on the page by their respective IDs. Now, this code is very long for such a simple task. It's also kind of messy and it's a bit brittle. So if anything were to change, for example, the username had a different ID or the password had a different ID, then both of those functions would not be working. So this test case is not very robust in the sense of working week after week with very little maintenance. And so that's the code-based approach. That's kind of the idea behind it. Now looking at kind of another approach that we wanted to highlight more is the declarative test automation. So for those of you that are Salesforce admins or familiar with the Salesforce kind of point and click to configure, so that's what Provar is. It's really more of a point and click testing tool where you can actually build out your test cases through the Salesforce UI. So rather than relying on a programmer or developer or someone who's an automation engineer to build out the test cases using a particular programming language, you're doing it all through a user interface, through a point and click to configure test case. So in this brief example that you see here, the user is just adding a mapping to type some text into the company field for this particular lead. And so this is how test cases are built out in Provar. You right-click on the element you want to interact with and you add it to your test case. And Provar takes care of the rest. You don't have to keep track of IDs. You don't have to worry about your test case breaking if Salesforce makes a release because it's Salesforce aware. So that's kind of the big difference there. Now getting more into code-based test automation and kind of the more detail-based differences. So when we talk about code-based test automation, as you can kind of see in the previous slide, there's very minimal transparency. So you're not really sure what's happening under the covers or behind the scenes unless you're the developer who wrote it. And then you may not even know if you come back to it a year from now what you were doing. For those of you that write code, you kind of know what I'm talking about. And of course, if you have to inherit code from someone else, that becomes a bit of a pain point as well. So there's very minimal transparency in the sense that it's hard to tell what's going on unless you're the person who had a direct hands-on in it. And also there's a lot of maintenance associated with this. As I mentioned, if any of those IDs were to change, well then your test case is no longer working. So there's no real reliability there. You're never really sure if the test case is failing because the workflow is broken or because the test case itself is broken, because you now have to go and maintain your actual test case rather than make a development change because you found a bug. And as you can see, and as we highlighted as well, there's no real knowledge of Salesforce, and there's no native support for Salesforce built into these kinds of frameworks. The way that these frameworks are traditionally designed is that they're meant to handle the entire web. So there's no real unique functionality built into it to handle some of the Salesforce functions and the Salesforce specific things like visual force pages, logging in as different users, profile testing, permission-based testing, those kinds of things. So if you want that kind of functionality, you have to develop it on your own and program it into the framework yourself. It ends up being a lot of effort behind that and a lot of technical debt associated with it. And one of the big things here as well is that the UI changes can be very painful. So if the page layout were to change, if any of the elements on the page were to move to a new location, your test case is now breaking and you have to go and debug it and figure out what happened. So in this case, if the login on the login page, if the username field were to move to a new location, that test case may no longer work based on how you automated it. So they're not very resilient or robust in the terms of UI and page layout changes, which, oh, by the way, tends to happen quite a bit in Salesforce. And then, of course, they're quite the opposite of what Salesforce is really trying to hit home with, and that it's all code, not clicks. Now, kind of the difference here in declarative test automation. Firstly, when you look at a declarative test automation script, you can read it. You can go through the test steps and you can tell exactly what's happening. They're very human readable in that sense. And in that sense, it's also very easy to collaborate on these test cases. So you don't have to worry about someone having a different coding style or trying to interpret someone else's code as a different foreign language. You can look at it and tell exactly what that test case is doing. And so that's a very beneficial part of this, because we want this to be open to not just developers and programmers, but also admins and architects and those who are not very familiar with coding and different things like that. And also there's a lot lower maintenance associated with declarative test automation. You no longer have to go and fix your test cases every single week or worry about page layout changes breaking your tests, or Salesforce releases themselves making changes, and then of course you having to go and figure out what Salesforce changed and how that affected your tests. And that kind of goes along with the next point here. It's Salesforce aware. So there's a lot of things built into the framework to handle some of those things I mentioned before, such as profile testing, logging on as different users, testing visual force pages, testing flexi components, embedded tables, related lists. All those kinds of things are native to the framework, so you don't have to build them in there yourself. And one of the most important things here is that it's UI agnostic. So page layout changes are all okay. If a button changes positions on the page, our test case is still going to function just fine. And then lastly, of course, because it's all declarative, it's clicks, not code. So kind of going back a couple slides when we talked about the QA job and it being kind of a monotonous job of having to run regression tests over and over again. So there's this concept of exploratory testing, which is really why you should be worried about freeing up your QA. So there's all these kinds of edge cases out there, and there's all these scenarios that users are going to execute that you didn't necessarily think were part of the normal workflow. What I'm really talking about here are all the different paths that the user might take, besides the happy path. So when we talk about exploratory testing, some of you may not have even heard this term, but really what we're talking about are all these edge cases and all the different scenarios that may happen and the different data that may be put into your application to make it behave differently. So testing these kinds of things is always going to be one of those things that's done manually, just based on the aspect of it. And so when we talk about this, really the first thing that you really want to do if you want to go towards exploratory testing is create what we call a test charter, which is really just a guide or plan to kind of get you through what you want to test, how you want to test the application, what kind of data you want to use, how you want to keep track of it, and maybe who should be thinking about which test scenarios are the best candidates for this kind of testing. Another important aspect here is that it's time boxed and you have a centralized objective or goal. You want to get to where you want to get in a certain amount of time, and you don't want to waste too much time on this because there are other important tasks at hand. It's very easy to get in the weeds when you start to get into all the different scenarios, but it's best to kind of limit this as you go about this process. And one of my favorite points here is that it's very low documentation. So yes, of course, you should take notes. You should document what steps you take to get to a certain point in your test case and what your results are, what data you use. However, these kinds of scenarios are not necessarily part of the happy path. And so they're not necessarily something that's going to be included in your regression testing. It's not going to be part of your regression cycle or your release cycle. So it's not necessarily something you're going to test every single week or every single month for that matter, but you do want to document it should the case arise. This will help make your application more robust and more adaptable over time. And one of the most important points here is that it encourages out-of-the-box thinking. So the QA job is not meant to be a monotonous job. It's meant to be a very creative job. You think about all the different ways you can break the application, all the different things you can do to make the application behave differently. So when it comes time to choosing a test automation tool, we encourage everyone to do their due diligence. So do your vendor comparisons. And how you really do this is kind of up to your organization. But the first thing you really want to do is list out the requirements that you may have in a tool or whatever your requirements are for testing and prioritize them. So have an idea of which requirements matter more than others. For instance, does it need to be included in integrations? Does it need to work with different tools that you already have? Those kinds of things are important to consider. And then next, are they aligned to the Salesforce roadmap? What we really mean here is if Salesforce makes a release, how does this tool respond? Are they aware of Salesforce making changes? Do they have their own kind of patch cycle or release cycle to go along with Salesforce? This is a very important aspect of test automation because you want test automation tools to be cognizant of the different tools they're testing. And if you want some more examples of a checklist that you can do for automation and vendor comparisons, we encourage you to kind of go out and do your own homework, but here's a good search that you can look at. If you just Google Salesforce bin, what is test automation in Salesforce and why does it matter? You'll get a pretty good checklist to start from there that'll give you an idea of what you're really looking for and what we kind of recommend as different important points to look at when you're doing a vendor comparison. And of course, you definitely want to organize your demos. You always want to have more than one demo. Don't ever decide to go with a vendor on the first demo. Definitely do your due diligence and go out there and get different demos and proof of concepts to make sure the tool can work in your own environment. It's one thing if you see a demo and you see how it's represented in a prefabbed environment, but if it works in your own org, well, then it's a lot more convincing. So you definitely want to see that, and you also want to do these comparisons and have the right people on the call, on those calls at the right time, so that they can ask the important questions, find out your requirements, and find out these different things in this checklist as well. And another very important thing to consider is how the tool plays with other solutions that you may already be using. For example, if you're using any DevOps solutions or any kind of release management tools, such as Flowsum, does the tool play nice with those? Can it integrate into the rest of your DevOps cycle? When you're doing regression testing and you're doing test automation, you definitely want that to be a part of this. So for example, with Flowsum and Provar, we're able to actually link deployment records directly to Provar test cases. So that way we can make a deployment in Flowsum and we can execute our regression tests and we can know exactly which deployment ran which test cases and what our results were and have some kind of actionable items out of that. And it's kind of built right into the process builder. So if you want to configure a process builder that has several different processes, you can include your actual running of your regression tests based on whatever your criteria may be. For example, if you want to run a particular group of test cases for this process, then you could do that. And you can change that based on whatever criteria you want to use. So it's very parameterized and dynamic, and you can make it completely configurable according to your requirements. And part of the important thing here is that it is integrated as far as test results and reports. So you'll get those as part of your process as well. So any kind of tests that you ran, you'll get actionable reports out of that. And it's all visible inside of Flowsum. And we do have the documentation on this integration on our website, should you want to look more into this, but all these things here are achievable through Provar and Flowsum. So the summary, so we talked about closing the regression gap with test automation. The number one thing we talked about was ensuring consistency. So we wanted to make sure that we had a suite of tests that are going to run the same way each time we run them. So regardless of who's running the test cases, because it's an automated process, we don't have to worry about two users who do things a little differently. We're always going to get a consistent test that's going to run the same way each time. And then next, we're really focused with accelerating our release cycles. So QA is no longer a blocker as part of our release because we have these tests that are automated. We don't have to worry about executing them during the day. We can run them on the weekend. We can run them overnight. They don't have to actually be done when someone's live and at their computer. And of course, as we mentioned, exploratory testing, this is really going to free up your QAs for those other activities that are very, very valuable to the business, such as discovering those edge cases, those kinds of bugs that come up when users don't do the happy path when something goes wrong. So then we talked about declarative tools and we talked about the code-based approach. So of course with declarative, the centralized idea here is that they're easy to read, they're easy to understand and maintain. They're Salesforce aware in the sense that they have an idea of what Salesforce is, and there's tools that are built into the framework to support Salesforce and its native functionality, such as profile, permission testing, visual force pages, and the like. And there's other technical challenges that it can help solve, such as migrations or things of that nature. So this will help your testing of those kinds of migrations and those kinds of projects, so that way you don't have to do it all manually. And a really big point here is that it's all lower maintenance. So as Salesforce makes its releases, you don't want to have to worry about going and update your tests every time Salesforce makes a release and maintaining all the broken code. So the idea here is the tests will be very robust and they'll stand the test of time. So the next steps, so as we said, it's always a good idea to review your own test practices. So how much time are you taking on regression testing in terms of your full release cycle? How much time does it take? How is that scope increasing? So do you see yourself a year from now being able to keep up with your testing based on the resources you currently have? And if you are doing any exploratory testing, it's a question worth asking. Are you thinking about the edge cases? Are you thinking about all the different scenarios? And when you think about the testing approach that may be right for your business, thinking about whether or not you can stay manual if you're doing everything manual. Like I said, in a year from now, can you see yourself still getting by with the same testing practices that you're currently using? And the next thing to think about is if you need an automation strategy, which direction is right for you? If you currently have a suite of developers and programmers that are familiar with all the different automation frameworks, then maybe code-based will work for you. However, declarative is one of those things that's meant to be implemented by anyone. They don't need to be a developer. You can repurpose the current resources that you have rather than go out and find automation engineers for a specific purpose. And so that's it for this presentation. If you'd like to learn more, you can visit our website, provartesting.com, where there's blogs, recordings, and other articles. And you can also contact me directly if you want. But that's all for this presentation. I'll open it up now to questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. Great presentation. We do have a few minutes for questions. First one I'm seeing is, how can incorporating DevOps solutions help us in our regression testing?
Yeah, good question. So when you're thinking about regression testing, obviously that's a piece of the DevOps pipeline. So you definitely want to be thinking about how you can incorporate what you're doing in terms of testing into your overall, your CI/CD. So if you're doing any kind of automated deployments, if you're using version control, if you're using a release management tool such as Flowsum, you want to think about how these other tools can work in conjunction with that. And that'll help you achieve really true DevOps where you have everything is automatic. You don't have to worry about manual intervention. You don't have to worry about relying on human intervention at certain points in the process. You can really just check things in, do all of your deployments, and have your regression testing automatic as well.
And next question, in researching different tools for test automation, what are the key features that we should compare?
Yeah, this is a good question. So definitely reference that checklist that we pointed to on the Salesforce bin article. So thinking about the different integrations that they have, thinking about the level of knowledge that you need to use the tools. So like I said, if you have a lot of developers, if you have a lot of engineers that are familiar with a framework already, then it may make sense to go with something that they're already familiar with. However, if you don't want to go out and hire those kinds of resources, if you don't already have them, then think about being able to repurpose the resources you have to use a tool that's easy to learn and easy to kind of maintain. So that's one of the biggest things that we see. And you definitely want to see whether or not that tool works with Salesforce. So you don't have to worry about Salesforce releases breaking whatever you may already be testing.
Great, and we do have time for one more question here. Do we need to write any scripts to use this tool?
So in the context of Provar, no. So it's all done through the UI. There's no scripting behind it. All of it's done in a point-click interface. So it's all done through drag and drop commands and pointing and clicking, similar to how you configure Salesforce. So you don't have to know any kind of coding or anything like that. It's all done through a user interface, and it's all click and configure.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for your questions. I'm sorry we can't get to each one here on the live webinar, but we are going to end here. We're at our time for this session. I do want to give a big thank you to Michael. Thank you so much for joining in today and giving such a great presentation for us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.